industrial accidents,
ancient
solving
poisoners,
crime,
poison
chemical
prevention.
spills. This is Toxic History.
Dr. Michael Hodgman is a medical toxicologist with the Upstate New York Poison Center. He completed a fellowship in medical toxicology at the University of Pittsburgh and has a long-standing affection for all the trivia and history of our specialty. And so with that, Dr. Hodgman, I give the mic to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to take everyone on a journey back to the late 1800s, Dwight, Illinois, and Dr. Leslie Keeley, the founder of the eponymous Keeley Institute for the Treatment of Alcoholism and Other Addictions. I have no financial disclosures for this presentation. Dr. Keeley was perhaps America's most famous addiction physician of the late 19th century. Certainly not the only, but as far as fame and controversy, Dr. Keeley was a well-known figure 130 years ago, and a household name throughout the United States. His story and that of the Keeley Institute and the Keeley Gold Cure is an interesting account of one physician's approach to addiction medicine in the late 1800s, a time when the country was awash with various dubious treatments and elixirs. Was he a quack or a visionary? I think a nuanced look at Dr. Keeley and the Keeley Institute is in order. And I would argue that his gold cure elixir notwithstanding, he was an important player in the evolution of our approach to the treatment of alcohol use disorder and other addictions. To start, my interest here springs from a talk I gave at the 2013 ACMT spring meeting on the history of alcoholism. While preparing that talk, I came upon Dr. Keeley and the Keeley Institute in Dwight, Illinois. I was surprised I'd never heard of this before. My father grew up in Dwight, and I had spent many a summer day and holiday in Dwight, unaware of its part in the history of treating alcohol use disorder. Dwight is a small town about 75 miles southwest of Chicago, with a population of just shy of 4,000 people today. Its 1890 population, about half that. And yet Dr. Keeley put Dwight on the map both nationally and internationally. Dr. Keeley attended Rush Medical College in Chicago and enrolling in 1860. His studies were interrupted while serving as a surgeon for the Union Army. And it was there, while witnessing the hard toll of alcohol abuse, that it is believed this either sparked or contributed to his interest in treating this malady. After the war and completion of his medical studies, Dr. Keeley set up a practice in Dwight, where his interest in treating alcoholism continued. In 1879, working with an Irish chemist and pharmacist, John Oughton, he announced the discovery of the double chloride of gold and sodium for the cure of alcoholism, what became more commonly referred to and mislabeled as the double chloride of gold, a stoichiometric impossibility. Dr. Keeley began to market the gold cure by mail order, advertising widely in newspapers and magazines, and within a year was also selling formulations to treat other addictions as well. This part of Dr. Keeley's business is certainly a bit shady, and if Dr. Keeley had only marketed this elixir, he would have been lost to history as just another purveyor of a dubious elixir. But in addition to marketing the elixirs, Dr. Keeley established a residential program in Dwight, and it was this program and its success that propelled Dr. Keeley to widespread acclaim in the early 1890s. This was a 4-week residential program for alcohol use disorder on an open campus. They also had programs for opiate and other addictions as well, but I'm going to focus on alcohol today. If a client arrived intoxicated or in withdrawal, they were first lodged in the Lexington house where they were stabilized. Withdrawal was managed with whiskey with malted milk, dosed as needed to symptom control under the continuous supervision of a 1-to-1 sitter. It was after this acute intoxication or withdrawal had been addressed, if necessary, that the clients began the main part of the Keeley program. I want to first highlight the medications, and after that, I think I will highlight what are the more important other aspects of the program. Medication-wise, this included the Gold Cure Elixir every 2 hours while awake and QID hypodermic injections. The hypodermic injections the client might receive were a red, a blue, or a white bottle, and which one or ones of these 3 injections a client received depended on that person's needs as assessed by institute physicians. During the treatment phase, there was no limit on the continued use of whiskey with malted milk. But once entering the treatment phase, clients were warned that any continued use would make them very sick. And the Institute utilized not just the power of suggestion, but also apomorphine and other emetics administered covertly to those who continued to use alcohol. It must have been quite a sight to see this many people lined up 4 times daily for their hypodermics. Women were treated more discreetly. They received their injections in the privacy of their rooms to lessen the stigmata of women receiving treatment for an addiction. And as an aside, although men made up the majority of the individuals treated for alcohol use disorder, for opioid use disorder, women made up a larger percentage of those receiving treatment, a reflection of the inappropriate use of opiates in the latter 1800s to treat a variety of maladies. Women boarded in their own segregated housing, with mixing of the sexes forbidden amongst clients. Dr. Keeley closely guarded the formula for his gold cure, as well as the injections used. And although we cannot definitively know what those medications were used by the Keeley Institute now, I suspect they were very much the same as those used by other physicians treating alcohol use disorder at the time. The inebriate pharmacopoeia of the late 1800s included a variety of anticholinergics for sedation, sometimes dosed to a mild degree of delirium, stimulants such as strychnine, the closely related brucine, digitalis, and cocaine, sedatives such as chloral hydrate, bromide, veronal or barbital, the first commercially available barbiturate, and paraaldehyde, to name a few. And then there was a whole basket of other purgatives, emetics, herbal extracts, tinctures, heavy metals, as well as opium, cannabis, and ethanol that might be used. I think strychnine is interesting. In the 1880s, Russian physicians had observed that it seemed to reduce the craving for alcohol. And subsequent research has demonstrated a possible explanation for this. There are glycine receptors located in the nucleus accumbens, where dopamine release is integral to reward and reinforcement. As a glycine antagonist, at least in rats, strychnine prevents ethanol-induced dopamine release. But what about the Keeley gold cure? Dr. Keeley credited the works of Paracelsus as his inspiration to investigate gold as a remedy. The earliest gold salts created by the alchemists were gold chloride and gold fulminate. And despite an interest in using heavy metals in medicine in the latter Middle Ages up into the 1800s, these 2 gold salts had major problems, gold chloride being extremely caustic and gold fulminate explosive. In 1811, a French physician described the preparation and use of the muriate of gold and sodium, or the double chloride of gold and sodium, and reported that it was more effective than the toxic mercury compounds used at that time for the treatment of syphilis. This news traveled to the US, and the successful use of the double chloride of gold and sodium for treating syphilis was reported by a Dr. Cheeseman at New York Hospital in 1812. Although his results were not reproducible and viewed with some skepticism, this compound made its way into the United States Pharmacopoeia in 1820. After that, it doesn't seem like there was all too much interest in this compound until Dr. Keeley's announcement in 1879. But I think a big question is, did it even contain gold? Or better put, did it ever contain gold? I suspect it originally did. By the late 1880s, however, the formulation likely contained no gold. Several investigations of the elixir in the early 1890s revealed no gold. One was done for the London Society of Medicine, and the other was reported by an Australian physician, Dr. J.E. Usher. The London analysis found mostly ethanol, sugar, salts, and a few herbal products. I'd note that at the prescribed dose, the ethanol dose over the course of the day was less than 1 standard drink. In contrast to this, we have this recipe by Dr. Chapman, who may have worked at the Keeley Institute. And it includes the double chloride of sodium and gold, as well as strychnine, atropine, quinine, and cocaine. And I'd note that at the prescribed dose, the total daily dose of strychnine, fortunately, is less than the adult lethal dose per gold francs. But I wonder if this recipe may be close to, or in fact, the original recipe from 1879. In 1885, the Keeley Institute halted production of the elixir and actually closed their clinic for what seems to have been, serious and intolerable side effects from the elixir. And although some of these may have been anticholinergic, what stands out to me is the dose of the gold salt. In the January 10th, 1884 issue of the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, they reported on the side effects of the salt when it was used to treat albuminuria at a total daily dose of only 32 milligrams. Acute side effects were predominantly GI, but the chronic toxicity included sialuria, weakness, emaciation, tremors, and other nervous phenomena. In June of 1886, the Keeley Institute introduced a reformulated gold cure and the clinic reopened. My suspicion, consistent with the tests in London and by Dr. Usher, are that the reformulation contained essentially no gold. Frederick Hargreaves, who had been involved with the Keeley Institute in the 1880s, testified that the gold salt wasn't well tolerated, but that there also is a trace of gold in everything when asked if the elixir contained gold. And we have Dr. Keeley himself stating that it would take a river of fluid to give a quantitative analysis. Although not a homeopath in his writings, he had defended the German homeopath Samuel Hahnemann as a counterbalance to what he saw as some of the excesses of allopathic medicine in the 19th century. So my suspicion is that after 1885, the gold cure at most had a homeopathic dose of gold, and that the other active components of the elixir were also removed and administered by the injections that were provided QID. These are the primary components of the 3 bottles used for alcohol use disorder, as reported by Dr. Covey, a physician who worked at the Keeley Institute, and confirmed by several other Keeley Institute physicians. They're all typical medications used for treatment of alcohol use disorder at that time. So if there's nothing unique about the medications, why did the Keeley Institute stand out? It was most likely the program and not the drugs alone. Although the disease concept of alcohol use disorder goes back to at least 1790 and Dr. Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia, this was still a minority point of view in the late 1800s, as aptly put by Dr. Norman Kerr. The prevalent approach at that time was to marginalize these individuals, treat them as sinners, criminals, mentally ill, social outcasts, and whatnot. And treatment could include incarceration, including at inebriate asylums. Dr. Keeley treated alcohol use disorder as a disease. Clients were treated non-judgmentally with dignity and respect. All staff followed a code of ethics, and clients were encouraged to share their experiences and struggles, provide mutual support. They were encouraged to get outdoors, get exercise. There were trainers to provide fitness instruction and weekly lectures on healthy dietary habits, sleep, and hygiene. I think it was these features of the Keeley Institute program that were instrumental for its success. And Dr. Keeley himself argued it was more than the drugs, it was the system. By 1890, the Keeley Institute was very successful with clients and referrals from across the US. The Dwight Daily Star and Herald reported that hundreds of clients arrived weekly, some weeks as many as 700 arriving by train. And a widely cited against the Keeley Institute reputation was a challenge by Dr. Keeley taken up by the editor of the Chicago Tribune, Joseph Medal. As Mr. Medal described it, they went away sots and returned gentlemen. Favorable press appeared in major papers throughout the US. And in fact, the Keeley Institute was so successful, they were unable to accommodate the demand for its services, so they branched out. The first in Des Moines, Iowa in 1891, and by June 1893, there were 118, including in branches in London, Mexico City, and cities in Canada and Australia. Contributing to this success also is the Keeley League, organized in 1891 by graduates of the program. This was an organization to provide ongoing mutual support and camaraderie for graduates of the Keeley Institute. With its own nationally distributed magazine, the Keeley League had features that would be foundational for Alcoholics Anonymous, regular meetings, pledges of abstinence, camaraderie, and support of other members. The 1890s were certainly the heyday of the Keeley Institute, with over 400,000 patients treated at one of the clinics by 1900. But for all of these successes, the medical establishment looked upon him with scorn, with several organizations all but calling him a charlatan. But although chastised, even some of his critics acknowledged there seemed to be something about his program that worked. Dr. Keeley claimed an unrealistic 95% cure rate, but we do have some numbers from the 1890s, one from the Christian Advocate, a pro-temperance Methodist publication with a very large circulation then, with 51% remaining free of alcohol use, and 18 of the first 20 patients treated at the London clinic were still abstinent at 2 and 3 years post. Not all accounts were positive, however. There were reports in both the regular press and medical journals of treatment failures and relapses. What's unassailable, though, is it worked for some. And although we have better medications today, how much better are we today at treating this all too common affliction? I'd like to complete the arc of the Keeley Institute. The heyday was the 1890s, but the rapid expansion proved challenging with quality issues managing so many branches, and they began to contract in the 1890s. They also had imitations, success bred imitation, and there were many, many gold cures by the latter part of the 1890s. And there was an economic downturn, the Panic of 1893, that may also have contributed to declining numbers. Dr. Keeley died in 1900. His longtime partner, John Outen, resumed leadership, and he soon settled the gold issue and declared the formula would no longer contain gold, and gold was removed from the label. And we can see in this Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 compliant label that even the ethanol content is declared on the label. The last two international branches, Mexico City and London, closed in 1916 and 1917, respectively. And then the Prohibition came. During the Prohibition, Dwight was still treating hundreds of clients yearly, but this in contrast to the hundreds weekly in the 1890s. The final bell, however, tolled in the 1960s. In 1965, the last franchise in Greensboro, North Carolina closed. And 1 year later, the Dwight Keeley Institute closed its doors, unable to compete with state and community-based programs any longer. So to summarize, he had a multimodal approach to treat alcoholism as a disease. And although he was not unique in the perspective of considering the disease, I think it was this multimodal approach with humane management, a code of ethics for the treatment of patients that were all features that would become part of treatment programs today that were part of his success. And I think that Dr. Timothy Hickman from Lancaster University put it best. The real gold was the system. And I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I'll pass this back to Adam.